Thank you. This, Mr. Speaker, is going to be one of the most pivotal weeks in the history of American public broadcasting. As early as tomorrow, we will be voting on a continuing resolution that would call for the elimination of all federal government support for public broadcasting. Now, I'll admit, this is very personal to me. If this reckless act were to be taken, it would mean that my local award-winning public broadcasting station, Oregon Public Broadcasting, would lose $2.4 million annually. Funds that we are used to invest serving Oregon and Southwest Washington and a little bit of Idaho, with programs that keep people informed, inspired, that help educate our youngest citizens. Actually, through the magic of internet, people enjoy programming online across America because of the quality of Oregon Public Broadcasting. Now, there's no question, as some of my colleagues were just discussing on the floor, that there's hard budget work ahead of us. I look forward to opportunities to eliminate unnecessary agricultural supports and rebalance those efforts. I look forward to helping rein in spiraling Medicare costs, not eliminating health care reform, but accelerating opportunities to reform it and make it more efficiently. I look forward to looking at the largest area of expenditure dealing with the Defense Department in discretionary funding. Without question, there are a number of areas there the American people know and understand that can be adjusted. However, we must do this in a way that is thoughtful and does not disproportionately impact our rural communities, our children, and universal access to high-quality TV and radio programming. Funding for public broadcasting gives our communities just getting all choked up at the prospect of this, that losing that funding that gives our communities a voice by covering local news and events in a way that weekly papers cannot and commercial radio and TV stations do not provide. Today's media is rarely locally owned. Huge corporations send managers to deal with papers and radio programs. Public broadcasting is the only locally owned and managed media in America. I am joined this evening by a couple of my colleagues, and I look forward to engaging in this conversation with them. I note, if I could start with my colleague from Kentucky, Congressman Chandler, a champion of public broadcasting, as well as a very fiscally conservative member of Congress. Welcome this evening, and look forward to your thoughts and observations.
Well, it's good to be here with you tonight. It's a tremendous opportunity to talk about something that's also very important to me. But I want to just start out by saying to my colleague from Oregon, Mr. Blumenauer, how appreciative I am, and I think how appreciative so many people are across this country, of your championing of public broadcasting over the years. You've been an incredible champion of that effort, and I just think it's marvelous because of what public broadcasting means to all of us. As you mentioned earlier, we heard some of our Republican colleagues talking earlier about some of the budget efforts that were going to be made, and I must say, we do need to have that discussion here in Washington. There's no question about it. It's a discussion that our president is now engaging in, and the Congress is going to be engaging in the next little bit about what programs we can cut. And there's no question that there are some that need to be cut. We certainly need to get our fiscal house in order in this country. But zeroing out funding for one of the most successful public-private partnerships responsible for 21,000 good American jobs isn't the thing to do. In these tough economic times, more than ever, we need to support American jobs and invest in our people. And cutting funding for public broadcasting does neither. Until now, public broadcasting has enjoyed strong bipartisan support. In fact, in my home state of Kentucky, and by the way, I've heard the gentleman from Oregon talk very much about the success that his public broadcasting system has had. I must say, ours in Kentucky has done rather well also. Indeed. And it's something that we're very, very proud of. But in my home state of Kentucky, a Republican governor actually provided Kentucky Educational Television, or KET, with its first operating budget in 1968, helping KET hit the airwaves, and it's now being very ably run by the daughter of one of my Republican predecessors in this office, Shay Hopkins. This station has touched countless people throughout the years, and today it is used by more than 1 million Kentuckians each week in a state of only around 4 million. So that's a pretty significant number. And you can see how important it is to our state. But completely cutting all corporation for public broadcasting will make KET cut at least 31 full-time jobs and 20 part-time jobs. These cuts would be on top of the 24% workforce reduction that KET has already endured in the past 3 years. KET has said that this loss of staff could hinder their ability dramatically to serve our Commonwealth. And our public radio, just like public radio all across the country, will certainly be affected. How many people across our great nation wake up to NPR and Morning Edition and drive home to All Things Considered? It's a very, very important part of life, I know, in my home state. We have stations like WEKU in Richmond, Kentucky, and WUKY in Lexington that touch all parts of Kentucky, including very rural parts of our Commonwealth. WEKU radio out of Richmond has been serving Kentucky since the 1930s, and they've already gone down 30% recently, and this, of course, again, would force more layoffs. Public broadcasting is uniquely American and should stay that way for future generations. My 3 children grew up watching Sesame Street just like I did when I was a kid, and countless others received basic skills and workplace education, and some even received help with college credit courses through KET. WEKU and WUKY provide local programming and local news that can't be found elsewhere. So please join me today in support of public broadcasting. These stations are too important, and we just simply cannot let them go away.
Thank you. I appreciate your eloquence, Congressman Chandler, your long-standing support for public broadcasting, helping us have a constructive dialogue here in Congress to make it better.
Well, another thing that it does, of course, if I may, it increases the civility of our discourse in a time when so many stations are sensationalizing the news. There's one place that we can be sure that we can get a civil dialogue on both sides of the story, and that's public broadcasting. So thank you so much for all you do.
And before I turn to my good friend from California, Congressman Farr, I just want to follow up on one element that you made, because this is vital infrastructure that connects Americans, particularly in rural and small-town America. People who otherwise would not have access. There's always going to be public broadcasting in New York or Washington, D.C., San Francisco, but it's rural and small-town America that is going to pay the price if we lose the support for this infrastructure. Again, being very parochial, but it's not uncommon for what happens in the Midwest, in Kansas, in Texas. In rural Oregon, it costs 11 times to extend a signal to remote Burns, Oregon, and Eastern Oregon than to deal in the metropolitan area. So these 1,300 independently owned and operated public broadcasting stations are going to be severely crippled in terms of their ability to meet the needs of rural and small-town America. And I'm going to speak in a few moments about some of the unique programming. But the point is that the signal itself depends on the type of subsidy we're talking about here. And now, if I may, turn to my colleague, who has been a supporter of public broadcasting back in the day when he was a local official and dealing in the California legislature, Congressman Sam Farr.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. This is a very important discussion, and I wish we could do it really in an open debate where we could have a debate on this, because I don't think that there's a person in this country that doesn't realize how necessary it is to keep our electorate well informed. So I join the chorus of well-informed listeners tonight to support America's Corporation for Public Broadcasting. I find it ironic that the news got released today, the day when you think of a National Day of Communication, a day when we tell our loved ones how much we appreciate them through words and symbols. And here we are attacking the very essence of America's foundation for information that is not commercial information, that is not paid for to get it, and have to have ratings in order to people to purchase the commercials. It's a sad day that Valentine's Day is used today to destroy something we love so much. It's mean news to hear some of my Republican colleagues who want to cut almost $500 million out of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting on a time when the world has been dedicated to watching what's going on in the Middle East and Egypt, which is essentially the essence of communication, the essence of technology, but also the freedom of technology. And in America, we don't own like BBC and Canadian broadcasting, where the government owns the stations. We allow nonprofit entities to do the broadcasting, both on television, as you indicated, Mr. Chandler, and all of our, I don't think you can raise children in this country without appreciating the value of what's learned, the lessons learned by programs such as Sesame Street and others. But to think that you can just cut this out as a value to a greater debate of balancing the federal budget by eliminating this, it's nuts. This is what I always call the persons who know the price of everything, but the absolute value of nothing. Because cutting this is, you can come up with a price tag, but the value you lose to the American public. You know, I wake up, here we are in Congress, and we're obviously, we need all the news we can get. I don't know a member of Congress who doesn't wake up listening to NPR radio. Of all the choices we have on both sides of the aisle to get unbiased news in the morning before we come to work, and I know it because when you're on it, people comment it the minute you get here. They hear you on NPR, everybody says, I heard you this morning when I was getting ready to come to work. This is not just done by members of Congress, this is done by everybody in the United States. And what Congressman Blumenauer talked about is that the rural parts of America would never have this program. You never have access to this information. If you want to destroy rural America, then destroy their access to information. Because then the only thing the young population will do is have to move out in order to keep up. So we have to make sure that these nonsensical cuts, which have dramatic and negative impacts, are not made to this budget. Let's sustain the budget to keep Americans well informed and ensure that future generations of the richness of public broadcasting. Let us give back our hearts and minds to the American public by maintaining PBS.
Thank you, Congressman, for your eloquent statement, your support, and your being with us here this evening is very important. And I think your point about how we start the day, how many of us were relying on public broadcasting for up-to-the-minute results of what was going on in Egypt, at a time when the large corporate news organizations are cutting back their foreign coverage because of the dedication of hundreds of thousands of sponsors, voluntary contributors, public broadcasting has expanded its international coverage, extraordinarily so. But before I turn to my good friend from New York, I would just make one reference, however. Although the international is certainly critical, it's very important for us here in Congress, one of the things that I think is so essential to zero in on is the local programming for rural and small-town America. Lakeland Public Broadcasting in Bemidji, Minnesota, the only broadcaster for much of their service territory. In Colorado, KVNF is increasingly the point source of news and public affairs programming, emergency preparedness alert, as the print media continues to shrink and corporations kind of move in and automate small radio markets. I mean, I could go on through the list. I won't, because I do want to provide time, but there is special coverage in the upper Midwest, in the Northwest, in the mountain states, that is tailored to hard-to-serve areas that no commercial station is willing to invest in this type of quality. To turn our backs on it is one of the most reckless things that can be done. And frankly, it's a terrible optic for my Republican friends in their first weeks in power, turn their backs on 170 million Americans who enjoy and rely on it every month. In fact, if you look at the survey research about what people want to protect, they want to protect our strength in defense. Number 2 is public broadcasting. And yet, this is on the chopping block. With that, may I turn to my good friend from upstate New York, Mr. Owens?
Thank you very much. I appreciate your leadership on this. When you talk about rural, I represent rural. 14,000 square miles makes up my district, 1,000 miles around the perimeter. I live in a very rural place, and public broadcasting is extraordinarily important to each and every one of my constituents. I have to do a bit of a disclaimer first. My wife works for our local television station. She's the education director. I volunteered at the station for 3.5 years, and I was the host of a television program, and I was also the lawyer for that station for about 25 years. So this is a real family affair for me. I'm most disturbed because I see what's going on in this situation as really a slash and burn tactic that is primarily focused on public broadcasting. It is an attempt to take the continuing resolution and make it into a piece of ideology. That's not what our constituents are asking of us. They want us to make an economic decision and do an economic analysis of where we are and where we're going. I think it's extraordinarily important that we focus on the economics of the debt and the deficit and not on ideology. We have an opportunity to act rationally and in a bipartisan fashion. As we did in the last lame duck session of Congress, our friends and neighbors at home demand no less. I can agree to cut $100 billion, which is actually about 3% of this year's budget, if we do it by sharing the pain. Let me tell you a little bit about public broadcasting. My children grew up with it. It is part of the education that my family experienced. My grandchildren are growing up with it. This is the best in family values and quality programming that you're going to see. If our colleagues on the other side of the aisle are concerned about the development of morals, integrity, and education, then public broadcasting is a place they should support, not kill. Just a few thoughts. My public television station provides essential services to that upstate rural community I talked about. It's aligned with their mission to inform, educate, involve, and entertain. Public broadcasting is America's largest classroom. closing the achievement gap through innovative, standards-based educational content and resources for parents, teachers, and students. Public broadcasting serves as a trusted partner and agent of better citizenship in the world's greatest democracy. Public broadcasting is not a luxury we can't afford, but an essential service regularly depended on and enjoyed by 170 million Americans in all 50 states. Let me repeat that. 170 million Americans support public broadcasting. Cutting or eliminating federal funding for public broadcasting will have a severe negative impact on local services and economies in all 50 states. Let me point out that public broadcasting directly supports 21,000 jobs, and almost all of them are in local public and radio stations in hundreds of communities in America. Science-focused programming at all age levels, from Sid the Science Kid to Nova, supports the acquisition of 21st century problem-solving science skills. I could go on. It's clear that public broadcasting brings a dimension that we see in no other modality available to us. I agree that reducing spending is a priority, but it must be achieved without resorting to ideologically based slash-and-burn tactics that will not allow us to facilitate a compromise with the Senate and White House, which brings real reduction in spending based upon the shared pain which we all understand is needed. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Again, as only a dedicated volunteer of public broadcasting could come forward with that eloquence and the personal story. I deeply appreciate it. A couple of facts that I think that ought to be on the table. We are talking about less than 1/2 cent per day per American. We are dealing with organizations that have amazing volunteer support in each and every one of our communities. And they take that 1/2 cent a day and they leverage it. Each dollar of federal funding can leverage $5, $6, $7 of local programming and benefit. And you said something, Congressman Owen, that I thought was very important when you talked about the programming. In fact, each of you mentioned it. This is the only medium that is geared to programming to our children, not to sell them something, but to educate and enrich. It's the only area that they have access to.
If the gentleman will yield, I think what's also very important is this is one government program where there is no free lunch. It requires local match. It requires a contribution by the community, by volunteers. So it's not a paid-for program without raising the money in the local media, as you know in your own station and had to do every year in the volunteer drive. So it's, you know, when you think about it, you don't go out and match public volunteerism to buy military equipment. You don't match voluntary equipment to do practically any other thing in American society. So this is one budget that really depends on the popularity of the programming in order to get volunteer support, volunteer contributions, and volunteer help in the studios. Why would you cut out something that the private sector and personal commitment thinks is so important?
And boy, does our community volunteer. I know in all of our communities we see an enormous amount of volunteering, and I appreciate what you just said, Mr. Farr and Mr. Owens from New York. Thank you all for your strong support over the years for this, and to point out the importance of education. I mean, this is, as we've all said, the only public entity that educates us on television and radio on a regular basis. And that is an incredibly important thing. But you know, the other thing that's so important about it is it truly broadens our horizons. Mm-hmm. It doesn't narrow us like so much that we see on the television. It broadens our way of thinking. And in what other place can you get that on a regular basis in our culture? This is a special American institution.
I would even say it defines our civilization. When you think of programs like StoryCorps, collecting that information for the records and keeping that part of our oral history of America, it's absolutely essential that our culture and our times and that our moment in history in the world be maintained in the public sector where there isn't private ownership of it.
And it's always had such bipartisan support.
Yes, this is the first time there has been a partisan effort, apparently. I mean, we had efforts before when our Republican friends took over. There were assaults on public broadcasting, but there was strong, ultimately bipartisan support that beat it back. And at home, these 170 million Americans, they aren't just Democrats or Republicans or independents. It is a broad spectrum of Americans who rely on information that isn't pre-filtered for them. There are opposing views. We've all heard things on public broadcasting that, well, I don't know that I agree with that. Or we've heard things that we never would have listened to in other venues. And I don't want to our counsel and our volunteer and our spouse of a public broadcasting member.
In my conversations that I've had the opportunity to have over the last couple of days, clearly public broadcasting understands that they're going to have to share the pain with everyone else. It's one thing to cut somebody's budget 3 or 4%. It's another thing to eliminate their budget. No one survives when their budget is eliminated. People survive and prosper when they have to make up 3 or 4%. And that's what I'm urging our colleagues on the other side of the aisle to really think about.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Any other final words?
Thank you for your leadership. It's absolutely essential to America's well-being.
Well, we look forward to continuing this conversation on the floor of the House. There's been an exciting outpouring of support around the country where people have been invited to look at the facts and share their opinions. And I know that this is making a difference because every member of Congress is hearing from the men and women they represent about the value of public broadcasting. And if what they are hearing is anything like what is coming in to my office, it is overwhelmingly in the support of this vital program and urging us to do the right thing. I deeply appreciate my colleagues joining with me this evening and look forward to continue to spotlight this and to work to make sure that rather than eliminating public broadcasting, we work to strengthen it so that everyone in America can benefit. Thank you very much.